At this time, I'm going to invite our panelists to come back and join us. And I'll just take a moment to reference the time. It's 3:05. We had originally scheduled to go till about 3. And so I'm going to invite the panelists, if they're able with their schedules, to stay on with us until about 3:30. There's a lot of questions that have come in on Slido, and we'd like to take a moment just to have that discussion and engage with you and kind of get into the questions that people are asking us. We understand if you're not going to be able to stay and you need to log off, we understand and respect your time. So with that, I will potentially throw to Jason if you can. Good? Yeah. Thank you.
No, that's good. Sorry for the waving around here. I'm not an experienced news anchor. I'm hearing something weird in my earpiece and just trying to figure it out with the tech team here. But Carrie, I'm going to come back to you on to the question that I posed to you just after your talk, and feel free to take it wherever you feel is appropriate. But really looking to explore the idea of monitoring from a Western science perspective, and then considering that what might be different or additional or however otherwise appropriate when considering Indigenous or traditional knowledge perspective.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I came up with a couple of items. One is science is really just based on observation. Like, we have this scientific theory, and it works in any situation and in any culture, but it's really the culture and the society that determines what type of question that you want your monitoring to answer. So if your question is, we want to know if the total amount of cross-section area is the same, because we don't want to change that. That is kind of what's one question you could answer, because you know that you want to show a no net impact. But if your question is more Indigenous in nature and it wants to show like how well does this work for fish in the long term, and have we returned the energy to the river, then you would monitor slightly different aspects. You would monitor more of a rate of change, and you would monitor more related to how that water interacts with its floodplain and how it interacts with the fish. Because fish are neutrally buoyant, so just providing them a certain amount of water depth does not really do what they want. And that might be sort of a Western science approach of like, well, we know in the literature they need a certain amount of depth. But in terms of what guidance we're getting from elders is that it's actually this combination of depth and velocity that creates this kind of flow that fish are looking for, and they need a diversity. So I think number one, it relates to the question that you want to look at and what you want to answer. The other thing is the time, the scope and time. So often, if it's a monitoring project that says, all right, in 2008, there was a spill or an impact to this river, and we're going to go back to that, is our ground zero. And a lot of Indigenous monitoring doesn't use ground zero quite the same. It would be quite a bit further back in time. So that it not only the river is not improved to exactly what it was in 2008, but it's improved to a state that the river is happier in, if that kind of helps to explain the differences there. So it's the question, and where you set ground zero, I think, are two of the key pieces.
And so would you say, do you monitor different things then in consideration of the Indigenous perspective as opposed to if you were only approaching it from a Western science perspective?
Yeah, so as an example, we could potentially monitor the Okanagan River just for what it looks like compared to the natural section 3 kilometers upstream. Or we could monitor this one space downstream, more related to how much it needs to change over time. So instead of just saying, okay, so we want the cross-section to look like a cross-section upstream where we know it's natural, we can say, well, we want this cross-section to have the energy to change and move its gravel bars to a different type of cross-section. I don't know if I'm being totally clear, but it's it relates more to how you see this river. If you see it as this changing, evolving space, then what you're monitoring to as your goal is going to be different to, well, we just want to return it to what it was 5 years ago before some particular damage happened. Does that make it a little bit clearer?
Well, I'll see if I'm kind of taking away what you're intending. Like, I think what I'm hearing is the at least experience you have in this case from the consideration of the traditional knowledge and Indigenous knowledge has been. It's not that that's not compatible with the Western science perspective, but it adds dimension to that, and is maybe not as bound by the traditional methods of Western science, but augments those with other ways to express the values.
Yeah, so we do use Western science to monitor an Indigenous idea or an Indigenous question. So you can use science to observe anything. It depends. The question, the objective that you're trying to achieve is always cultural or society based. And we need to kind of think that through because we're dealing with two cultures in one space.
Well, that's very helpful. We did have a couple of questions along those lines come up earlier in our session today. So we were kind of saving them to explore those after your talk. So thanks very much, Carrie. And with that, we'll just carry on with our panel session here, and I'll turn it over to Dale.
Okay, I think the next question is addressed to you, Casey, if you don't mind. It's an age-old challenge that we experience, communications between biologists and engineers. And in this situation, it's around riprap and the incorporation of riparian, and that's a discussion sometimes that we're still challenged with understanding or finding an appropriate solution. And so the question is really, what tips do you have to help present the riprap or the riparian incorporation into the riprap argument?
This is going to sound maybe like a little bit of a sucky, soft answer, but honestly, I think it just comes down to having relationships with human beings across disciplines. I think before we started this, Carrie and Tom and I were chatting about how going to lunch with people makes all the difference. There's no reason why we can't come to an understanding, but it involves talking to each other because there's not a lot of cross-pollination of ideas through the literature. We're not reading each other's papers as much. And I do think that there's some perceived ideological differences. And certainly one of them is very firmly around erosion of stream banks and whether or not that's a desirable characteristic of rivers. In fact, I think there's even a paper called Erosion of Stream Banks is a Desirable Characteristic of Rivers. But it's not a conversation that's going to shift until people who are in a particular space working on and caring about that space come together and have human conversations that move beyond those ideological differences. Just like any other ideological difference, you have to have relationships with people who are maybe on the other side of the fence.
No, I really enjoyed that response, Casey, because it is important how we communicate with each other and making sure that we are understanding really upfront about where we're trying to get to. And if we have opposing viewpoints and objectives and not the interest to get to a common place, then it will become really always a difficult conversation for us to work together. But I do agree with you. Building relationships is probably the most important thing we can do. Now over to you, Chrissy, whichever way I'm looking.
Thanks, Dale. I have a few questions here, but I'm actually going to jump back to Tom. Something you mentioned while we were just chatting a moment ago after your talk was about the methodology is surface temperatures and that there's differences underneath. So if we have some restoration practitioners who are interested in maybe partnering with some academics or partnering with people who have this technology, what would you say are there site-specific recommendations for where this is important to use? Do you need to use it in low flows, or what are some take-home messages because you are only seeing the surface? Is there site-specific considerations, or are there pieces of information that we can, kind of share with our restoration practitioners for where this methodology is well implemented?
Yeah, sure. That's a really good question, and I've had some issues related to that in terms of setting up of monitoring equipment and things like that. So I'll answer this sort of in two parts, one related to thermal infrared and then one related to in situ monitoring. As far as the thermal infrared imaging, there's basically two times that you can do it, and we focused on one. So you can do it during, or one of the best times to do it, I guess, is during summer base flow conditions where you're going to expect to have the warmest main stem stream temperatures. And in that way, you'll see sort of the greatest difference between main stem temperatures and like some cool water plume or upwelling that's showing up in your thermal imaging. The other time that the literature would show that you can do it, and I haven't done this, I've looked at a bit of this data, is actually just prior to freeze up or during freshet, where you'll see the reverse signature of, instead of like in the summertime, you'll have a cool water signature in a warm river. You'll see a warm water signature because groundwater is stable. So when the main stem river temperature heads towards zero, you'll see a plume that's actually warmer than the main stem. And as far as that's for the thermal infrared, but as far as the monitoring of in situ temperatures, some of the key things to keep in mind, different systems have different hydrology, and so making sure that your equipment is going to be wet for the entire duration of your data collection period is key, obviously. And so this can be a bit challenging when you're dealing with fluctuating temperatures, trying to get out there as soon as you can following freshet, but also trying to get your equipment out before some kind of unforeseen fall flood type of event happens. And then also with your in situ monitoring, where you actually collect groundwater temperature and surface water temperature data within sort of like your physical macro habitat types is also going to make a difference. Hyporheic water generally tends to infiltrate in sort of the run portion or on the riffle because it's got a higher hydraulic head, and then it'll tend to exfiltrate at the bottom of a riffle. And so you'll get different signatures in temperature and vertical hydraulic gradient depending on where you actually put these this equipment. And also, just as I mentioned before about, these upwellings are very discrete. And so even at some of my most prominent upwelling sites, just based on small changes in location, I would get differences in the total amount of hydraulic head, just because I found that, that sweet spot where there was a bit more hydraulic conductivity causing a higher water elevation in my piezometer. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much for that clarification. We have quite a few more questions on the chat, so I think I'm throwing to Jason if you'd like to bring us the next one. Thank you.
All right, Casey, next one's for you. It's from Jessica Griffith. Is there an idea for monitoring frequency and duration for riparian vegetation? She says it's common to use a 5-year period in compliance, but for vegetation, that never seems like it's enough. And for frequency, it seems annual wouldn't be as efficient in the later years. So open for you to comment on that.
Well, I can tell you a very handy thing about cottonwood that's not necessarily true of all riparian vegetation, but it leaves annual bud scars. So you can come back 10 years later and look at how much an individual plant has grown each year for every year that it's been established there. So even if you can't go back every year, you can still get sort of a record of how well that plant has been doing in that space over a period of time that it's been there. So that's kind of neat, and having a little bit of background in botany can allow you to pick up on those kinds of things. But in terms of, riparian habitat monitoring in general, as I mentioned, it's there's a lot of processes that are related to what's going on in the river. So it depends on what you're monitoring for. If you're interested in monitoring herbaceous vegetation that is going to be there annually, then obviously you have to go back every year. It really depends on what you're trying to do.
Well, that seems like an obvious answer to the question now that you said it, to me anyway. But from the insights you've gained from your studies, say, I live in Kamloops, so familiar with the drier part of the interior. I think one of the challenges that I see is how frequently do you need to monitor to know if you're, let's say whatever it is you're trying to plant and you want it to be successful. Have you learned anything around you need to monitor a lot early on and less later, or if just monitor till spring, and if it's all good after that, don't worry about it till next spring? Or are there any rules of thumb that you have picked up that might be useful guidance for our restoration community?
If you're monitoring plantings, you should go back at least once or twice within the first year, because after that, there might not be anything left to monitor, frankly. But if you're monitoring a restored site and you're looking at natural regeneration, then yeah, again, it depends on if you're looking at long-lived species. It depends on if you're looking for species whose establishment is associated with, basin-wide events like floods of a certain magnitude. If you know that it's something that's not likely to colonize until you have a 1 in 5 or 10 year flood event, then maybe go ahead and base your monitoring on whether or not that event has occurred. Mind you, if you go in earlier, you might find that assumption that you had was incorrect. You might find that things establish on different timescales in some of these sort of novel ecosystems that are highly impacted. A lot of these theories around how long it takes cottonwood to establish, for example, were developed in much less impacted systems than we have in the Okanagan. So what I'm finding is that through my research, a lot of those kinds of assumptions are probably incorrect and don't necessarily work in that system. So maybe early on, monitor more frequently, once or twice a year. But I don't know. I don't know what to say. I don't want to necessarily tell anybody what to do. It's a terrible position to take, probably, as an expert on a panel.
No, not at all. Yeah, and I think it's a fair point to say, go back to what your first answer was. It depends what your objective was and what you're trying to do. And I think that was a refrain even from this morning when we were talking about some of the science advice for monitoring. So I think it's a fair point, and it was a good answer. So thank you for that. And Dale, I'll turn it back to you for next question.
Sure, Carrie. The next one's for you from Marcus, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get this question right, but when you went through your presentation and you talked about the 10-year project in the Okanagan River from its conception, and Marcus is curious about what some of the hurdles were that you faced, some of the obstacles, and I guess just how you resolved some of those setbacks or those obstacles were overcome.
So all of the hurdles were humans. There was when you have like a sort of a channelized river that's been channelized for 40, 50 years, people kind of tend to lock that in as being normal or like the church of the river, and they feel safe with it. And they didn't understand, a lot of people didn't understand if we set the dikes back that they would be just, if not more, safe. And river restoration on that scale, it was a fairly large project, and there was just a lot of people trying to throw stones at the idea, which was not a bad piece. It wasn't a bad thing to go through. We had to kind of keep pushing, and so that made it took a long time to convince everybody that it was going to be okay. That it was going to be okay in the end. The good part about going through all those questions in that first 10 years was we discovered a lot about the broad diversity of knowledge of people that we had brought into that steering committee. So as a fisheries biologist and fluvial geomorphologist, I was sitting with the dike managers and the water managers and was trying to understand what their perspectives were moving forward. The plant and terrestrial people were trying to understand what the aquatic people's perspectives were moving forward. And during that time, we started understanding what each other's issues were going to be. So by the time we got to the next project and even the next project, we now go into the meetings knowing, like, I know what you got. I know what your problem is. I know what you're going to say. I know what the issue is. And we then monitor or feed this committee the information they need to make good decisions, knowing the questions that this diverse group of people are going to have. So that was one element. The other one was trying to blend biology and engineering together and make those connections, because biologists have a tendency to come to these steering committees being like, well, we want it to look more natural. And an engineer doesn't necessarily understand what that means because they're working in a different series of calculations. So when they're working with a river model, they're like, well, is that depth? Is like at what flow? So we've identified now, and part of the reason these projects move faster now is we already know, we want to know what a Q200 is going to look like. We want to, in the river model, we want to know what a Q2 is going to look like because that's a channel forming flow. We want this combination of depths and velocities that's represented in a Froude number, which is an engineering term, and that we know is where sockeye like to spawn. So if we talk engineering-ishness, they can build it. And it really comes down to the biologists learning that skill. Because it can't be an expectation. Where biologists come to these meetings a little too fluffy. We want it to look pretty. We want it to look more diverse. We want it to look natural. It doesn't actually tell an engineer what to design in the end. And how to design and what this is going to look like. So I think an engineering versus a biologist understanding engineering better is a good skill. And then allowing time for this growth of a committee to understand what each other's issues are before we shut them down type of thing, because then we know what hurdles we're coming up with and they often have really great solutions. So not being closed to those, but being very open to them.
I'm going to use that word next time I play Scrabble with my wife. Engineering-ishness. Great answer. Relationships, again, what Casey was building on and developing that common communication about what we're trying to achieve. So thank you. Over to you, Chrissy.
Thanks, Dale. And I think I have the pleasure of posing our final question for today. And the top one on the list, I'll just go with that one, is back to Carrie. A nice technical one to end us for the day. Are you doing any ongoing monitoring specifically related to target species use or avoidance of those boulder clusters that you were talking about, and specifically during peak summer temperatures?
Yes. The answer is yes, we are.
Fantastic.
We monitor during the peak summer at these boulder clusters. A lot of it is to monitor for fish presence and absence and kind of how they're using the boulder clusters. And we do them with snorkel surveys. We do them in the heat of the summer. We do them. A lot of the diversity, again, is going to come from how these fish need those spaces and when they need those spaces. And it really relates to the discharge and the temperatures in the river and what these fish are experiencing, and then using these spaces as refuge. So just saying that they're not there doesn't necessarily mean they're not using them at different times of the year and for different parts of their life history, for either feeding or for refugia, or even in winter. So we do monitor them in the summer in their worst case scenario, because we have a very small monitoring budget, but we do know by the fact that a lot of us live here and drag our kids to these spaces and are constantly kind of monitoring. We do see them being used in a variety of discharges and temperatures.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to thank you all for staying a little bit longer with us today. And I will pass to Dale and he can wrap up our session. Thank you again for your time.
Wonderful. So to close, the information that we heard today has really highlighted to me that the complexity in considering and undertaking effectiveness monitoring or any type of monitoring at the local scale, and how increasingly more challenging it becomes when you start to consider watershed and ongoing land use practices, is just really profound. It's not an easy topic to simply address. With that, I really want to once again acknowledge our speakers for sharing their time and their experiences with us today. It's truly been my pleasure, and on behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, sincerely thank you. I want to acknowledge both David Reed and David Pell, who are in the back room there, that were doing the Slido work and helping develop the seminar. And of course, Oh Boy Productions for a well-run workshop. Once again, thank you very much. And finally, to the Pacific Salmon Foundation for their continued contribution and commitment to the salmon resource. With that, I thank you all for attending, for staying later than we scheduled. Look forward to seeing you soon at our next webinar. Take care.